All right, so it is 6:30 now, so I'm gonna get the ball rolling. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Coal and Health Virtual Town Hall. My name is Nissa Peterson, and I'm a conservation specialist with the Alberta Wilderness Association, and I will be your moderator for this evening. So we are fortunate tonight to have a fabulous panel of speakers and a packed virtual house. So I definitely want to get the ball rolling on our discussions tonight, but before I do that, I do have a couple of housekeeping details that I need to share with you. First, when you join the event, your audio was disabled. Please keep your audio and video components disabled for the duration of the event, just to avoid any potential disruptions to presenters and the audience. And then this will also help with the technological bandwidth of our Zoom platform. Second, the event is being recorded and the recording will be posted to AWA's YouTube channel. So if you have any concerns with being identified, please change your screen name. Finally, if you have any technological issues and need help with the platform, my colleague Grace Bork is here on standby to help you out. You can reach her at her email address, which is gwork@abwild.ca. So just to give you a brief outline of the agenda, we have a total of 5 panelists tonight, and each of our panelists have prepared a brief presentation that ranges anywhere between 10 to 15 minutes. And after each presenter has spoken, we will have a question and answer period. So audience members are welcome to submit a question to the chat box feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen at any time during the presentation. I will be collecting these questions and facilitating them at the end of the panel. And then finally, I will hand off the mantle to AWA's Conservation Director, Ian Urquhart, for some closing remarks and thank yous. So with that being said, I am going to introduce our speakers. So our first speaker tonight is Lars Sander-Green. Lars is the mining lead for Wildsite and focuses on the impacts of coal mining in British Columbia's Elk Valley. Lars is passionate about clean water and holds a Bachelor of Arts and Science in Physics from McGill University. Aside from creating fundraising initiatives for Wildsite, Lars enjoys turning science into compelling narratives and crafting communication strategies that gets results. Following Lars, we have Kirby Smith and Lorne Fitch. Kirby is a certified wildlife biologist with the Alberta chapter of the Wildlife Society and is currently a member of the Conservation Affairs Committee for the Wildlife Society. Kirby has also served as past president for the Alberta chapter of the Wildlife Society. Along with Kirby, we have Lorne Fitch. Lorne Fitch is a professional biologist, a retired provincial and fish and wildlife biologist, and a former adjunct professor at the University of Calgary. Lorne has been a lifelong advocate for Alberta's trout and is deeply concerned about how cumulative effects from land uses will impact their long-term survival. Next, after Lorne and Kirby, we have Dr. Tim Takaro. Dr. Takaro is a physician scientist and a full-time professor at the Faculty of Health Sciences for Simon Fraser University. Dr. Takaro's research examines linkages between occupational or environmental exposures and disease and tests public-based health preventative solutions to reduce such risks. Over the past several years, Dr. Takaro's focus has been on gene-environment interactions and risk reduction interventions in dust-related occupational disease and childhood asthma. Dr. Takaro is also on the faculty for the University of British Columbia and the University of Washington and has recently retired from active clinical occupational medicine practice at Vancouver General Hospital. And final, but not least, we have Peter Sainsbury. Prior to his retirement in 2016, Peter was the director for population health in Southwestern Sydney Local Health District, in addition to being the past president for the Public Health Association of Australia and the Climate and Health Alliance. In addition to his qualifications in medicine, health planning, medical administration, and public health, Peter has a PhD in sociology and currently holds adjunct professor appointments at the University of Notre Dame, University of Sydney, and the University of New South Wales. And with that, I will hand it over to our first speaker tonight, who is Lars Sander-Green.
Thanks, Nisa. I'm just gonna get my screen going here.
Perfect.
Can you see that all right?
Looks good, Lars.
Great. Okay, so I'm Lars Sander-Green with Wildside. We're a small conservation organization just over the border from Alberta in the Kootenays in BC. And I'm going to tell you a little bit today about the coal mines in the Elk Valley, which is in the Rocky Mountains, just along Highway 3, north and south of the highway there if you're driving through the Crow's Nest Pass. So the coal mining in the Elk Valley has been going on now for about 50 years with open pit coal mining, more than a century when you're looking at underground coal mining that goes back to the 1800s. Right now, Teck, the mining company, is sending about 65,000 tons of coal per day, mostly to Asia, coming out of the Elk Valley from mines like this one. And so when we're talking about this coal mining, we're talking about mountaintop removal coal mining, and we're talking about very large scale. And it's hard to get an idea of how big we're talking about taking down entire mountains, over decades. We're talking about, slowly blasting them to bits. And what I think helps is to look, if you look at, you can see some little trucks in that photo there. And if you've ever driven down Highway 3, you might have stopped at Sparwood and saw the world's largest truck, which not actually the world's largest truck, I hate to break it to you, but it is a big truck, as you can see. And that big truck is the same as those tiny little trucks you're seeing in this photo. So we're talking about, 100 plus square kilometers of coal mining, the size of the city of Lethbridge, right in the Rocky Mountains. So it's massive. And when we're talking about the coal mining, we're also talking about what's going to happen in the future. And this is Castle Mountain, the newest proposal for a mine from Teck that they plan to take down this mountain over the next 50 years or so, basically just level that whole thing. So just to get situated here, these are the Elk Valley coal mines, which you can see are pretty large, not too far from Pincher Creek or Fort Macleod or Nanton from the Alberta side, right up against the Continental Divide there. So we've got 5 current coal mines there. One of them counts for 2. And we've got other mines that are being proposed as well, which you see here, Castle Mountain that I spoke about, Crown Mountain to the south. There's North Coal, which is another company proposing a couple of mines further south, and another one in the north as well. So we've got, just like you in Alberta, have these planned expansions looking at decades more of coal mining potentially. So what are the big issues with coal mining that we see in the Elk Valley? Certainly top of the list is clean water and protecting our clean water and all the water pollution that we're seeing coming from those coal mines. And that's clean water for people to drink, and that's clean water for fish to live in. And some other issues, coal dust, the human health impacts of having that coal dust in the air is a big one as well. This is from someone who lives near the mines, wipe their hand on, I think that's their hot tub cover, and got this kind of level of dust coal dust on their hands that's just coming through the air. And wildlife, of course, as well. Grizzly bears and all these animals that are traveling a long way are losing that connectivity, the ability to move through the mountains because these mines are so large. And, sheep and other animals are losing their homes essentially because these mountains are just gone. And finally, we're talking about climate impacts. When we're talking about that much coal coming out of the Elk Valley every year, it's a major contributor to global warming. So I'm just going to talk about 2 of those today because I don't have that much time. I'm going to talk a bit about clean water and protecting our clean water and about the climate aspects. And my colleague, Randall, will talk about those other aspects next time. So one of the most important species of fish that we have in the Elk Valley is the West Slope cutthroat trout. And these are some juvenile West Slope cutthroat trout in our area. And these fish are, not just valuable in and of themselves, but people, of course, are very interested in fly fishing for West Slope cutthroat. Throughout the Elk Valley, it's a pretty famous catch and release fishery. So one of the big concerns with fish is selenium pollution, and you've probably heard about it already. Selenium pollution is an element that's found in very, very small amounts in the water in our rivers that can be pretty dangerous both for fish and for people. Where we've seen levels of selenium in some of these rivers that could be 100 or 200 times higher than the levels that scientists tell us are safe. And we've got other creeks that are just so polluted that there aren't any fish left in them. Recently, near these mines in the Fording River, we saw an almost total population collapse in just 2 years. We lost 93% of the adult West Slope cutthroat trout. And that's in the part of the river that's the most polluted. So it doesn't take an expert to figure out there might be a connection there. And so what happens with selenium is basically it's a reproductive disruptor. So you've got selenium building up in the bodies of fish, and then when they try to reproduce, either they'll fail to reproduce or they'll get deformed offspring like this fry that aren't going to live very long. So we see fish like this with, spine that's totally deformed. And these are actual fish that were taken from eggs that came from the Fording River nearly a decade ago, or maybe facial deformities, etc. We also see some impacts on birds, and that's something that's been studied, but we haven't really got to the bottom of that yet. This bird, it's hard to see, but it actually has an inside beak that's sort of acting as a second beak, and it's thought to be a deformity. But really, it's a pretty silent disaster. I mean, you can look at this river and the water looks clear. It looks okay. And the amount of selenium we're talking about is measured in parts per billion. It's really a very small amount. So when we get these fish that can't reproduce, well, we don't see it because they're just missing fish until it gets so bad that it can't be ignored anymore. And when you get to that threshold, things can go very bad very quickly. And we think that's what we've seen now. So how does the selenium get into our rivers? So we have in the Elk Valley these waste rock dumps, which are basically just huge piles of waste rock that they've blown up the mountain, and they don't need this rock that's in the way, and they dump it in the nearest valley. And that's what you see here. And as water flows through those waste rock dumps, which are just basically loose piles of rock, it trickles through and it pulls out a little bit of selenium and some other pollutants, and then that flows down into the rivers. And over time, as we get more and more waste rock, we see a lot more selenium. And it's not just fish, of course, we're talking about whole ecosystems, all the way from algae to bugs, like these caddis flies. We see less bugs, we see less diversity of bugs. And as those impacts build up in the whole system, who knows what we're going to see next. So we're not just talking about selenium, of course. When we're talking in the Elk Valley, we have other pollutants coming from the coal mines. We have sulfates, we have nitrates, we have nickel, heavy metal, and more. Another big concern is calcite, which is basically calcium that's in the water that's coming out of this waste rock that actually turns the stream beds into concrete and can prevent those fish from spawning. And of course, it's not just a problem for fish either. This is Bill Hanlon at a ranch he manages just down by the Elk River in the middle of the valley there. Tech had to truck in water for years and years because the well was too polluted. It exceeded BC's drinking water guidelines. Now they've got a treatment system installed in his house, but he's worried about the water that he's giving to his horses out on the ranch there. And some similar has happened in the town of Sparwood. They had to replace a well as it was coming over BC's selenium limit. Selenosis, we haven't seen anyone with selenosis in the Elk Valley, but it's certainly not something you want to risk. It messes up your skin, your fingernails start to fall out, you lose your hair, and worse, etc. So that's not something you want to play with. And some of you might be thinking, okay, well, we've got this mining problem and maybe we can clean it up. We could, while we're mining, try to figure out a better way to deal with it. But the problem here is that this waste rock is sitting there and it's going to continue sitting there leaching these pollutants for centuries, maybe even millennia. We don't know. So all the mining we're doing today, we're piling up this waste rock, and that pollution is going to keep flowing. It's going to keep flowing into our rivers. It's going to keep threatening our fish. It's going to be our children's problem that we're going to be paying for the cost of this mining for centuries and centuries. And it's not just near the mines that we have these water pollution problems either. Dilution is the solution, except for in cases where you have biological accumulation, where as you go downstream, we have slower moving water. With slower moving water, we get into lakes like Lake Koocanusa, and we get more and more selenium building up in fish in their bodies, even though there's a much lower level of selenium in the water. So Lake Koocanusa is more than 100, 150 kilometers downstream of these mines, and already we're getting to levels that are about 3 times what's considered safe for fish. And we could see this selenium pollution even further downstream, hundreds of kilometers downstream, and actually goes into the States in Montana and Idaho, and then back into BC in the Kootenay River. We're seeing levels of selenium in water that's very concerning, in fish that's very concerning as well. And so, of course, Teck, the mining company, wants to tell us there's not a big problem here. And we found out they weren't even testing in the winter to get out on the reservoir to see what the selenium levels were in that reservoir in the winter, because they said it was too dangerous. Well, here's me, and I'll tell you it was pretty safe. And when it comes to fish, of course, it's more than just the fish themselves. It's also a concern if people are eating those fish. What we've heard from First Nations, from the Ktunaxa people who live in this area, is that if they're going to be eating those fish every day, as some of them would like to, there could be a significant danger from the selenium levels found in those fish to their health. So if you've heard a bit about coal mining, you might have heard, okay, well, there's a water pollution problem, but we're going to use water treatment. That'll take care of it. Don't worry about it. And we've been hearing that here for a lot longer than you have in Alberta. We've been hearing that for most of a decade now, and it isn't really working out very well. What I can say is, they might be able to treat some of the pollution and take some of the pollution out of the water with really expensive treatment plants like the one you see here. But that's costing literally hundreds of millions of dollars. And there's no long-term plan. No one's going to be running that treatment plant 100 years in the future, let alone 500 years in the future. And so what happens once mining ends is the question we want to know the answer to. What happens once they stop mining and the pollution is still flowing at the same levels? You might also hear about something called saturated rock fill, which you can see here. And maybe it works. It's pretty new. This is a pilot plant that's been running for a few years now. But no one knows what happens in the long term when you shut down these mines and you stop monitoring these things. You stop feeding the bugs that are treating the selenium inside. Maybe it all comes back out. We don't know. A lot of questions, not a lot of answers. So I don't have a lot of time here, but I want to talk a bit about cleanup as well, because we see something like this, and how do you clean this up? I don't know, and I don't think the mining company knows, and I don't think the province of British Columbia knows. Now, you can say you have money for cleanup, but there's never enough, and there's no real way to make this cleanup work when you're dealing with a mountain that just isn't there anymore. So I want to talk very briefly about climate pollution too, because people will say, okay, well, this is coal for steel making and we need this coal. Well, that's just not true. So we've got 1,000 train cars full of coal leaving the Elk Valley every day headed for Asia. And once that coal is burned, we actually are looking at more carbon emissions than all of the rest of British Columbia. It's every single building, car, factory, farm, whatever it is in British Columbia. All those carbon emissions are less than the carbon emissions from burning that coal to make steel. So what are the alternatives? And these alternatives are here today. We've got a pilot plant in Sweden right now that's making steel with hydrogen instead of coal. We've got technology that's already operating plants in Canada, in the US, around the world, that uses natural gas, which is then cracked, and you get hydrogen is for a large part of what you're using for that steel making. And so there's easy opportunities for us to switch to hydrogen for steelmaking, to get off coal and to cut that 5% of our total global emissions out. But the real question is just cost. And until we, accept that we're going to have to pay a little more for steel on an industrial scale, we're not going to see that change. But when that change does come, I think it's going to be pretty quick. And I think if we in Canada are left holding the bag with a bunch of mines that have just started up, or mines that don't have the funds to pay for cleanup, or mines that have created these very long-term water pollution problems, then I think we're going to have a really big problem. And that change could come very quickly. So let's not lock ourselves into a dying industry. We're not going to be the low-cost producer of coal in the world. That's Australia and always will be. So let's put coal in our past and not make it our future. And if you want to find out more about the coal mines in the Elk Valley, you can see our website, wildsite.ca. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lars. I'll now invite Kirby Smith to be our next panelist speaker. Kirby, I don't have any audio for you right now.
Hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, Lars provided a great segue for my talk. I grew up in Claresholm and spent most of my youth in the mountains to the west. And so I worked 32 years out of Edson and worked with coal mines in west central Alberta. And so I'd like to do three things in the next 10 minutes: to review problems inherent with open pit coal mining development as it relates to water and wildlife, assess cumulative effects relative to carnivores, and to evaluate the performance of open pit mines in west central Alberta. So Lars provided a fairly good overview of the selenium issue. Basically, when you start clearing land and making external dumps, you've got this large lens of rock above the coal seam that gets blown up, and the ratio, the mass to area ratio increases, much like turning a 5-gallon pail of water into ice cubes. And as water leaches through there, you end up with selenium coming out the other side. Usually in mountain environments, you're hard pressed to design settling ponds with sufficient capacity to withstand flows resulting from extreme weather events. So every spring, there are often issues. Entire sections of streams can be obliterated. And rather than backfill exhausted pits, the cheaper way is to have end pit lakes. And so you're often left with a legacy of end pit lakes that aren't very productive because they don't have much of a littoral zone because the banks are so steep. One of the other issues is reclamation. It's taken 10,000 years to develop the ecosystems that are on the eastern slopes of Alberta, and once the topsoil is removed, it's salvaged and stockpiled, but it's you can't get it all, and it's a very thin layer of topsoil. running old range management courses, I was told that it'd take 100 years to create an inch of topsoil in the prairies, and I believe in the subalpine it would take much longer. Topsoil is hard to get back on the landscape in short order, depending on. You have a thinner layer of topsoil. Basically, it's very hard to establish a forest. Consequently, usually reclamation reverts to grassland. So I'm not sure how long it would take forests to regenerate on mines. I'm sure it would be close to a century, might be two. The grassland is fertilized very extensively to stop, get vegetation to stop erosion. So occasionally you'll see small parts of the landscape where soil is stockpiled and forests are regrown, but most of it is grass. And it is really a single land use. It's not a multiple use. While you're mining, that's the only thing that's going on. And there's not much opportunity after reclamation, and that can be after this cessation of mining. One of the things the Alberta chapter of the Wildlife Society did, initiated by Lorne Fitch, actually, was to commission a cumulative effects assessment of what's called the C5 forest management area. And that basically runs from Canmore down to Waterton Park. And what it does is essentially takes computer-based mapping and grows the forest, cuts the forest, puts in roads, reclaims roads, that type of thing. And it's a tool that helps you forecast into the future, because at the rate that we're changing the landscape, it's hard for any one person to try and think this through into the future. Issues that I'd like to focus on today is carnivore conservation and connectivity of carnivore movement up and down the mountain range, which is the basis of the Yellowstone to Yukon initiative, trying to join this Rocky Mountains from the northwest corner of Wyoming all the way up to Yukon. And the Crow's Nest Pass is basically a bottleneck for carnivore populations, given that we just have a couple of mountain ranges on the Alberta side. We've got the Continental Divide and, of course, the Livingston Range. We have prairie to the east. And so this has been a focus for the Y2Y movement. And it's an issue in the sense that carnivores tend to have a low reproductive rate. They're at very low density, and they have low genetic diversity compared to, say, ungulates. So carnivores such as if they have impediments to movement, you need to be able to have young dispersing adults moving through the population to maintain the genetic diversity. The issue in southwestern Alberta is that, in my mind, is that in contrast to much of Alberta's eastern slopes, we don't have a protected area adjacent to the areas that we manage for multiple use to buffer the impacts of industrial development. In fact, as Lars has pointed out, there's entire valley is full of coal mines immediately to the west of the area that's under consideration in southern Alberta for coal mining. This was a map that was, I believe, used in the Grassy Mountain hearings back in November. But essentially, there's just a couple of areas where carnivores are expected to move through Highway 3, or considered for twinning. And so, if animals can make it through these two areas, the larger area to the north is the area that's up for coal exploration and development. And so this will seriously impede carnivore movement. The Livingston Porcupine land use footprint management plan has a goal that are dark purple and light purple. Keep the disturbance limited to 0.6 kilometers per kilometer squared restricted motorized access. Now, this doesn't consider industrial access. It's simply talking about recreational ATV use and off-road jeeps and the other main roads that are in there. And so there are areas in here that are upwards of 5 square kilometers of open access per kilometer squared, and the threshold for grizzly bear habitat is typically like 1/10 of that. So that's something that hasn't been considered. And if you look at the areas that are dark purple and light purple, all of that area between basically the Key Country and Waterton National Park is being considered for coal mining. This would be very detrimental. Grizzly bears are classified as threatened in Alberta, and open pit mining will compound existing impacts and make it more difficult for the species to persist. And one of the issues is that the generation time for most carnivores, say grizzly bears, might be 10 years. It's less than the mine's operation, which would be 20-25 years, plus the reclamation on top of that. So the learning process for carnivores to understand habitat availability is critical. There are a number of operational problems that have occurred during my tenure out of Edson. Currently, of the 5 active mines in West Central Alberta, 4 have ceased operation, Vista being the most recent one on February 5th, and the other one is in reclamation mode. So there's no operational, or there's no mining occurring on any of these. Every spring there's problems, but in the fall of 2013 there was a disaster in the Obed mine, and the fine was not anywhere near what damage had occurred. Well, I guess in summary, I'd say that selenium can't be mitigated. The loss of forest will probably take centuries to recover. Open pit coal mining is not sustainable, and coal, as mentioned earlier, is a significant contributor to greenhouse gases. And in southern Alberta, there's only the Livingston Range and the Continental Divide. Mountains and water are at a premium. Much of southern Alberta, moves to the mountains in the summer to get some clean water and to get some shade, get out of the heat. It gets loved to death. Connectivity for carnivores is jeopardized by coal mining in this landscape bottleneck, basically the Crow's Nest Pass in the area to the north. And the Eastern Slopes policy was established for water, recreation, and tourism as the main priorities. And I think it's important that this maintains, or these priorities are maintained in perpetuity. And with that, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kirby. Lauren, I'll invite you to start your presentation now.
Thanks, Lisa. Good evening. I'm going to talk about trout and coal, or maybe trout or coal. And let me start by pointing out that what we do in a watershed flows past and through a trout. The presence, the abundance, the distribution of trout is the indicator. It's the gold seal of water quality and watershed integrity. Native trout are a product, not just of the water, but of the watershed. And as such, every native trout species in the Eastern Slopes has declined, and 3 are designated as threatened. Those most imperiled include West Slope cutthroat trout, bull trout, and Athabasca rainbow trout. Coal mining is one more land use activity added to others like logging, petroleum development, and motorized recreation. Coal exploration and development adds to the cumulative impact and is a further risk to trout population survival. To survive and thrive, trout require clean, suitably sized gravels for spawning and for aquatic insect production. They require appropriate stream flow and groundwater recharge, also low velocity microhabitats so that juvenile fish can rear successfully. They need deep overwintering pools with sufficient winter stream flows and groundwater inputs, and they need cold water. These requirements are found in an intact watershed context and occur within a range of natural variability that trout have adapted to and evolved with over generations. Impacts of coal mining on trout include 4 features that I'll sketch out. The first, and Lars and Kirby have provided lots of visual evidence of this, is simply the loss of physical habitat. Coal mines have a footprint, and that footprint reduces trout habitat. It includes roads, stream crossings, exploration trails, and drill sites. It's the removal of streamside buffers of vegetation. It's the burying of drainages, of tributaries and stream valleys with overburden. And there is a failure rate of settling ponds, spoil piles, roads, pit walls, berms, and ditches, which is long and dismal. The second feature is changes in water quantity. The mine footprint irrevocably changes the natural plumbing in a watershed. Vegetation removal, compacted mine spoils, and mining roads speed up surface runoff, and groundwater capture declines. These mining features interrupt, block, delay, and divert flows, changing the amount and the delivery time of water to streams. Groundwater capture, storage, and slow release are affected, and the magnitude and frequency of floods in the spring and low flows the rest of the year are increased. And we should always remember that mines use water, especially for washing impurities from the coal, and often a majority of this water is lost to evaporation and is a loss for stream flow. So mining substantially affects the hydrological processes that generate stream flow and alter the natural flow regime. And trout are the first in line to feel these effects, as shifts in stream flow regime have substantial consequences, including the timing of water delivery, groundwater storage, energy dynamics, sediment amounts, and nutrient availability. We can't change how much water falls on the landscape, but with mining, we can see it delivered to stream channels faster without as much opportunity for groundwater capture. Remember, spring melt is the one shot for water capture to provide sustained flows the rest of the year. Hastening that melt, speeding it on its way, means stream flows suffer, beginning in summer and persisting through fall and winter. Stream temperatures start to rise as an added impact, and trout don't sweat, but they do feel the heat. One of the elements hidden from view is the extent of groundwater. That's snowmelt. It's held in the subsurface layers of glacially ground and water-worked cobbles and gravels. This refrigerated water slowly seeps back into surface flow, cooling summer water temperatures, and in winter providing water warmer by comparison to surface flows, key to successful overwinter survival of trout. Without this reservoir of groundwater, streams would cease to flow, especially in the winter, and the eastern slope streams would contain no trout. So mining has a major impact on groundwater. So third, and both Lars and Kirby have talked about this, there is a chemical stew liberated with open pit strip mining. Selenium, calcite, nitrate, arsenic, cadmium, chromium, radium, uranium, and cobalt, just to name a few. So once you expose the overburden, the blasted off tops of mountains, to oxygen and water, these elements begin to oxidize and then to interact with surface water. Now, sediment is generated from unvegetated slopes, from mine spoils, and from roads. Researchers have found sediment yields from coal mining can increase 1,000 times over that of an intact forest. The experience from other Alberta mountain coal mines and from mines in BC is there are periodic, chronic, catastrophic, and cumulative sediment additions to receiving streams. Sediment is a major limiting factor to native fish populations. Research repeatedly shows that increasing amounts of sediment decrease growth and survival of juvenile trout, and there is no threshold below which sediment levels are harmless to trout. Sediment includes ground up limestone, calcium carbonate or calcite, the raw material of cement. Even in its raw form, calcite is a binder that sets, hardens, and adheres to stream gravels. A female trout would have to evolve opposable thumbs to grasp a pick to break through this impenetrable layer to be able to spawn. And this is particularly prevalent in mountaintop removal coal strip mines where it's liberated with overburden dumping. Now, both Kirby and Lars have spoken about selenium, and I'll just add that selenium is an element that living creatures need a little of, but the difference between a little and a lot is minuscule. Small concentrations cause genetic abnormalities in trout. Slightly higher concentrations are lethal, and it's a bioaccumulator as well. And last, mitigation. Mitigation is the "don't worry, we know how to glue things back together again" promise. Most mitigation scenarios seem to be best on best case scenarios that assume everything works as planned, designed, constructed, and maintained. There seems to be no consideration of the reality of human error, negligence, design flaws, unanticipated issues, especially weather events, engineering constraints, construction problems, maintenance failures, or ineffective monitoring that fails to discern problems in a timely way. In the case of selenium, there is currently no treatment measure that has been tested over time, found to be effective at reducing concentrations to acceptable levels at mine scales, and is capable of being adapted to any mine. Because selenium may continue to leach from spoil piles for decades, if not centuries, there is the greater question of who's going to fund this expensive process, because the coal company will be long gone from the scene. The risk to water quality, to the aquatic environment, and to trout populations from coal mines is understated, despite evidence from other coal strip mines in Alberta and adjacent ones in BC that show the risks to trout populations cannot be successfully mitigated. We can turn to an old nursery rhyme to understand the promise of mitigation, restoration, reclamation, and remediation when dealing with the aftermath of a coal strip mine in the eastern slopes. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall, and all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. No one can glue the Humpty Dumpty of a mountain together again once the top is blasted off, the overburden dumped into adjacent valleys, the plumbing disrupted, the water contaminated, and habitat eliminated for trout. Mitigation and restoration are promises that in reality are charitably putting lipstick on a corpse. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lorne. Dr. Takaro, I'll invite you to start your presentation now.
Well, thank you very much, Laurel. I'm really happy to be here with all of you, and appreciate the efforts that you're putting together to save this landscape. I'm just going to run through some of the main health effects, and I'm going to try to make this relatively quick, and hope to get to your questions sooner that way. So I'm just looking like I have a little bit of a technical issue. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, I can see it, Dr. Takaro.
Great. Okay. This first image is to remind me about the land and to make a land acknowledgement. I live on Coast Salish territory, specifically Kikite territory. And some of you may know that we're fighting the Trans Mountain Pipeline, what we're calling now the Kenny Trudeau Pipeline. And this large cedar on the left is sitting on the route. And we've heard about the fallacies of reclamation. That is the restoration for the previous pipeline right-of-way that was cleared 5 years ago. And that's what they're calling restoration. The land is, of course, much more important to some people than others. This is the major health impacts of surface mining that I'm going to cover very briefly. And you'll see that it affects, in fact, almost all of the body's systems: the respiratory system, cardiovascular system, the neurological system, including our mental health. The hazards can cause cancer and reproductive effects. And this last category, hazards impacting food and water security and subsequent downstream impacts on culture, community, spirituality, and climate change, are ones that we don't talk too much about. And I hope in the discussion we can address this, because for the communities around these mines, these hazards actually may be the most impactful. So I listed all those health impacts, but really, while those are serious health impacts for the local community, taken as a whole, in terms of the planet, it's the product that these mines produce that cause the most mortality and morbidity worldwide. And that's because of the burning of the coal, which causes particulate pollution and is a primary driver of mortality around the world. Approximately 35% of global mortality has been attributed to air pollution. So coal has a big role to play in that. And then, of course, greenhouse gas emissions, which have already been mentioned. And I don't have time to go into all of the health effects of climate change, but they are immense, and we're learning more and more about them every year. And they, over time and over generations, would dwarf any of the health effects that I'm going to talk about in more detail in just a moment. Metals have already been mentioned, and of course these are human toxicants as well as toxic to other living things. The primary heavy metals produced by mines are arsenic, cadmium, mercury, and selenium. Those first three are all potent neurotoxins. They're also very toxic to developing organisms, as demonstrated by the trout. That's the same for humans. And these are also carcinogens. And it was mentioned that some of the tailings and downstream risks from mining relate to radon and the radiation of that element. And together with these other carcinogens, they may act in actually a synergistic way to cause cancer. Finally, selenium. That was an excellent presentation that Lars gave on the Elk River. This figure I'm showing you here comes from the International Joint Commission on Border Waters, which is very concerned about selenium. And we made this graphic in order to point out how tight the boundary of safe selenium levels is compared with toxic selenium levels, and that this means that selenium in drinking water is a big problem. And as was mentioned, treatment is generally not effective. So keep an eye on the heavy metals. Where does this evidence come from? Well, there is very strong evidence for health impacts from occupational studies. There are weaker studies done in community level. As you can imagine, it's very easy to study a captive population of miners, more complicated to study community level exposures. But we do know from occupational studies about the toxicity of coal dust, diesel emissions, the heavy metals that have been mentioned, as well as particulate matter produced from the coal dust. So these toxicants generally do not have safe levels. Now we regulate to certain levels, but that's based on how low can we reasonably get our PM 2.5, for example. We don't know if there is a safe level of diesel particulate. We don't know if there is a safe level of PM 2.5 because studies to do at that very low concentration are very, very expensive. So all we can say really is that there is no demonstrated safe level for these toxicants. We know that water and air measurements in mining communities, which are oftentimes in valleys, where meteorological conditions can raise concentrations, they're frequently measured above regulatory levels. And as was mentioned on the Elk River, the selenium levels have been measured often above regulatory levels. And the same can be said for many of the waterways downstream of mines. The weakest evidence, I would say, is this last point, poor general health indicators in the jurisdictions around mines. And this, this data comes largely from West Virginia. But what we're finding is that as we get down to finer and finer scales in the population studies, that the poor health indicators do hold up. So more heart disease, more diabetes, more diseases linked to socioeconomic conditions. This is a factor that needs indeed more study. So in terms of respiratory illness, it's the particulate matter that is largely to blame for the high asthma rates around mining communities. But chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, known as COPD, is also a major problem for miners and appears to be an impact for community members who are not workers in these communities with high particulate levels. Cardiovascular disease is related to particulate pollution. This inflammation causes inflammation in the coronary arteries and other arteries that lead to cardiovascular disease. The neurological diseases from heavy metals are ranging from central neurological illness in the brain, cognitive impairment, to peripheral neuropathy in the hands and feet. There are also neurotoxicants in the machining fluids, hydrocarbon-based fuels, and solvents that are used in mining. And these can escape from mines and cause illness as well. I want to talk a little bit about the mental health impacts. There is more and more evidence accumulating about the positive effects of greenness, of the ability to get out of an urban environment and enjoy green space. And there's also a newly described illness known as solastalgia, which is largely an anxiety-based illness that is precipitated by the loss of your home, of that feeling of being home when you're in a place, and particularly a wild place. It's described perhaps most eloquently by indigenous peoples who have lost territory and have lost their homelands and are at a loss for those anchor points that the land can provide. So solastalgia is that missing of the feeling of being at home in a place that used to be home. Anxiety and depression are frequently cited in areas of massive environmental destruction and can be linked to that exposure. Cancer is caused by many of the heavy metals that I've mentioned, but also by radon and other carcinogens. The reproductive effects are largely related to developmental abnormalities, not too dissimilar to those that we saw in Lars's graphic pictures for the fish. These are neurotube defects and other nervous system maldevelopment. Now, this last point, hazards impacting food and water security. This refers largely to subsistence living, people who live off the land. When your food supply is contaminated with heavy metals or is no longer available because of being cut off from wildlife corridors, for example, this can have a profound effect on food sources, and that is an important anchor again for a community. The effects of climate change on resource extraction is really just being noted, and I would just say that the vulnerable slopes and water supplies that have been demonstrated in the presentations that were ahead of me are exacerbated by extreme weather conditions, drought, and floods, and are an important aspect of the modern landscape. We have to be prepared for the climate disasters that are coming, and I'm afraid that at this point we are not. So we need more information on the impacts on early development, these reproductive effects that I've mentioned, but also early establishment of chronic diseases like diabetes, heart disease, and some respiratory diseases that the imprint of toxicological exposures in early life can have lasting effects. This mental health impacts, we don't measure them very well, and we certainly don't have large population studies to understand what is the health impact of having your home territory destroyed. And then finally, the long-term effects of on culture, on community, and even spirituality of these large industrial projects at a time when there already is considerable uncertainty because of climate change about how we are going to maintain ourselves in this changing world. Here's a good review paper if you want more information, and I'm happy to answer any questions, but I think I'll stop there in the interest of time. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Takaro. I will invite our final panel speaker tonight, Peter.
Thank you very much indeed, Nissa, and thanks for the invitation to take part today in this really, for me, interesting, depressing, interesting discussion about mining in Alberta and BC. I've been to both, I should say. I've been to Calgary. In fact, I've even been to Montreal at exactly this time of year, which was not the most pleasant experience in many ways. I think I'd like to go in summer. What I'm going to do is just try and weave together a bit of a story of coal and health and community and politics in Australia as I see it. It's my personal view. The previous speakers have provided all the information about the effects of coal at a chemical level, at a environmental level, soil, water, air, of health effects, the debacle of sort of rehabilitation. So I'm only going to touch on that as it illuminates the story I'm going to try and tell. The first thing I want to say is that there's one great similarity between Australia and Canada when it comes to fossil fuels, and that's that we each produce about the same amount of coal and oil onto the world stage, whether we burn locally and overseas. It's about 3.5% of total energy production is produced by Australian and Canadian coal and oil. The difference being that in Canada, 90% of it's oil, and in Australia, 95% of it's coal. But nonetheless, the total amount's the same. I'll come back to that point just briefly in a moment. Other than that, it's different, because from what I understand from the discussions that I've had before today, we're focusing very much on metallurgical coal here. Australia produces a lot of metallurgical coal. In fact, we dominate the world market really in terms of the seaborne trade in metallurgical coal. But our thermal coal vastly outweighs our metallurgical coal production. And people primarily think here about coal for electricity, both here and shipped to Southeast Asia. And people don't really make a distinction between thermal coal and, when people, I'm talking about the community, a distinction between thermal coal and metallurgical coal. It just all gets lumped together broadly. And the thermal coal we produce is, and burnt locally, is mostly burnt in coal-fired power stations adjacent to coal mines. And so people actually perhaps don't differentiate very much either coal mining and coal-fired electricity production in terms of the effects on the environment and the effects on health and one thing another. So where in a sense I'm going with this is that I don't think the Australian public at large pays a great deal of attention to the health effects of coal mining. Now, people like me and epidemiologists and health people, Tim's outlined the consequences very clearly. People do, but I don't get the impression that the public do, or that the public pays a great deal of attention to air pollution in Australia. I think most people would generally think, oh, well, you know, ours is fantastic. Look at what it's like in Southeast Asia or Eastern Europe or one thing and another. Ours is fantastic. What are we complaining about? They can't see it for the most part. There was a dramatic exception to that, I don't know, 5 years ago, when a disused coal mine that hadn't been properly, not rehabilitated, hadn't been rehabilitated at all, but properly closed down, caught fire. I mean, lots of them catch fire, but this got out of hand. And it very much threatened a village nearby. And it had to be evacuated, and there were dramatic pictures and the television and everything of this. You could barely see, you know, it was like this red haze. It was like being in the middle of a bushfire. And so people did get very upset about that. And there was an official inquiry, both into the cause and to the longer term health effects of that. But that was an exception. For the most part, people aren't too concerned about the health effects, in my opinion. Now, that said, as we've heard, coal has dramatic health effects. And I'm not going to reiterate the points that have been made, particularly by Tim, except to emphasize that, again, I think people forget that from go to woe, coal is bad for people's health. Whether it be the miners mining it, it's a dangerous occupation still. Whether it's the miners who are exposed because they just work around the mine, the local community, whether it's people along transport routes. That's been a bit of an issue here, particularly at Newcastle, which is the biggest coal port in the world, where coal is transported from the Hunter Valley to Newcastle, say a 2-hour train trip, with uncovered wagons. And so lots of coal dust gets blown off into towns and Newcastle as it goes to the port. That has been a bit of an issue locally. I don't suppose anyone in Sydney knows much about it. But so it's the transportation, it's the processing, and then of course it's the burning. It is harmful to health along its whole spectrum of use by humans, and that needs to be remembered. Actually, Tim, I don't know if you saw, but Hendricks wrote a review with a couple of co-authors in the Annual Review of Public Health last year, which updates that paper. And I was going to mention that to say, if people want a bit of a summary, then there's an update of that Hendricks paper in the Annual Review of Public Health last year. So that's quite useful as well. The only other point I'd make is that just recently there's been a paper published that's looked at the health, the premature mortality before, say, 65 or 75 years, depends how that's measured, around the world from this very small particulate matter, PM2.5, less than 2.5 microns. That's about a 30th of a human hair. So it's very fine. And it's up the ante considerably. The paper has demonstrated there's about 8.7 million premature deaths per year from PM2.5 produced from coal and oil around the world. 8.7 million. So I actually worked out what contribution Australian coal and oil made to that. I wrote it up in a blog I do over the weekend. Didn't cause any comment. I thought it would. So Australian coal creates about 320,000 premature deaths a year. And because of what I said earlier, then Canadian coal and oil, mainly oil for you, not coal, also creates about 320,000 premature deaths a year. So it's very, very significant. That's not all deaths, that's just premature deaths. So what I might just sort of move on to, having said that, is that, so what has generated concern about coal here? Well, it's more of the environmental issues, really, about loss of farmland, contamination of farmland with particulate matter onto horse studs, onto crops, particularly onto wine. The Hunter Valley is a big wine growing area. Land clearing and forest clearing and so on generally damage the environment. Loss of threatened species. The black-throated finch, which no one had ever heard of 2 or 3 years ago, is now iconic because it's threatened by the Adani mine. And so that's the sort of thing that's generated, albeit a response. In many cases, it's a local response, other than from people like us. So contamination of drinking water, disruption, as was well described earlier, of wetlands and riverbeds and so on, and streams drying out. Loss of indigenous sites, heritage sites, in cultural sites. This was related to an iron mine earlier this year, last year now. Iron ore mine where Rio Tinto blew up a 46,000-year-old cave that had been used throughout that time by Aboriginal people. Noise, and these are the sorts of issues that have caused concern locally, and roads and the heavy vehicles moving on the roads and so on. And of course, solastalgia that Tim talked about there. Solastalgia was developed in Australia, a guy called Glenn Albrecht. And he indeed expresses it, he describes it as the homesickness you feel when you haven't left home. That's exactly as how he himself describes it. And it's not only indigenous peoples, the peoples whose villages and townships have been destroyed by coal mines that are now principally open cut mines. That 30, 40 years ago, they were underground mines. Now they're principally open cut mines. That these people feel it very strongly, and in fact have been very, very active in opposing new or extensions of mines. And there's a town in the Hunter Valley, a town, it's not a town, it's hardly anything to it. It's a few houses and a shop and a church and one thing that they're called Bulga. And they have gone to court and gone to the Court of Appeal when they won, and the company and the government took it to appeal, and they won in appeal as well. And then the government changed the laws. Whoa, 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 what a surprise. You know, I mean, talk about whose interests the government looking after here. That's another issue. Indigenous communities have been very motivated. That's particularly the case up at this Adani mine that's being developed in North Queensland, that's become a beacon for environmentalists and coal people in Australia. They wanted to first start shipping or digging and shipping coal in about 2012. It's been opposed so strongly that they still haven't shipped any coal, but they are now building the coal mine. But it is iconic, and I'll just stand up and just show this. Yeah, we'll have to do our little bit. Got arrested last year for blocking the workers' camp, so they couldn't get out in the morning to go to work. And legal action's been very prominent here. There's an organisation called the Environmental Defenders Office who've been very active in supporting little groups to oppose things like the Adani mine, to oppose extensions, not just of coal mining, but also gas fracking as well. I say oil's not a big issue here. Well, not on land anyway, it is a little bit offshore. And so there's been lots and lots of action, lots and lots of demonstrations, public meetings, civil disobedience. And what's emerged, of course, is that this sort of interconnection between the whole fossil fuel industry and governments at federal and state level across Australia, the revolving door, the open access of coal mining and gas people to ministers and premiers and prime ministers and so on, how donations often follow a recent meeting and one thing and another. And there have been reports by Greenpeace and 350 about this. And so in some cases where things have moved to a little bit, well, not moved, sorry, that's wrong, that's still all present. But what's emerged a little bit in the last few years by both big organisations, international ones, Greenpeace and so on, or national ones here, Australian Wildlife Conservancy, Australian Conservation Foundation and others, is an emphasis on trying to change democracy. We're making very slow progress with the current democratic process, and maybe the emphasis now needs to be shifting as well to changing the democratic process, because until we do that, then it's very difficult to break this nexus between the fossil fuel industry and government. I'll leave it there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Peter. So that concludes the portion of tonight's event with the panelists. So we can move on to the question and answer period. I'm just going to share my screen. All right. So I'm sure there's going to be more questions trickling in as we go through these. One of the first questions I wanted to ask to the panelists was, what is the implication for water contamination for downstream users, particularly like irrigation?
Well, Nisa, I think based on what Lars has told us about the impact of the tech mines on downstream water contamination and how far it's gone, as in Montana and Idaho and actually back into BC, I think that mining of the scale that has been proposed, and this is, 4 to 6 mines in the Oldman watershed alone, I think that we could see similar impacts if that happens. And, things like irrigation agriculture could be put at risk, as well as the food processing industry, which has developed over the last 50 or so years in southern Alberta.
Any additional thoughts from our other panelists? Awesome. So one of the questions I have here is from Tracy, and Tracy asks, what is the federal interest, like federal government interest in some of these project areas? Is there an audience to be had with the federal government, or should efforts be focused provincially? Just wondering what your thoughts are on that, panelists.
Well, I can start again, Nisa. I think that first of all, the federal government has a major role to play with species at risk. And since West Slope cutthroat trout and bull trout and Athabasca rainbow are all species at risk, the federal government has a role to play in adjudicating whether or not these mines should go forward. I don't know so much about, whether or not the federal government's role in water quality, is based in legislation. But it seems to me that if there is going to be, as there is in British Columbia, a transboundary issue of water contamination, then similarly, I think that, the prairie provinces of Saskatchewan and to a lesser degree Manitoba would be concerned about this, and that may well be a federal responsibility as well.
I think the federal government does have some pretty major responsibilities under the Fisheries Act to protect both fish and fish habitat. Unfortunately, what we've seen in the Elk Valley is they just don't want to take on their responsibilities. They kind of have investigated, but they don't really want to enforce anything. They don't want to issue significant fines, and they don't want to deal with the long-term problem. And unfortunately, the federal government is developing some rules specifically about water pollution from coal mines, the coal mining effluent regulations, but they have been sitting on that and dragging that out for a decade now, and who knows when they may actually get it done. I think there's a lot of pressure from industry not to rush it, because they'd like to see their projects approved before those limits come in.
Just to say, in Australia, I think it sounds though we got a similar issue. There's a national legislation, and then each state and territory has its own. And environmental activists have used that at some times to sort of challenge things at one level, and when they've perhaps lost their challenge at another level, and that's been very successful in delaying things, because that's been one of the techniques: delay, delay, delay. But the federal government is actually trying very hard to sort of hand it all over to the states at present, and walk away from that, which is very worrying.
Wonderful. Thank you for your thoughts on that question. The next one I have is from Miles, I believe, and he is wondering if the panelists could elaborate a little bit more on landscape reclamation. I know, Kirby, you briefly touched on the fact that how long it takes for the soil and forests to regenerate. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Well, the simple fact that, you're working in a subalpine environment, or it takes, centuries to grow the forest back, I believe, if you can't replace the soil. And some of us were involved in a virtual meeting on the reclamation of the Cheviot mine here a couple of weeks ago, and they were suggesting there would be perhaps not an effort made to reclaim actively, but just to let nature take its course. So how long that will take, I mean, in one sense, it's better than using agronomic species, which has been, 20 years ago was the norm. Now I think it's evolved into using more native species, but you just can't get anything to grow back once you've disturbed it that bad to the level that it was there before, and it'll be centuries before it is. We've been Canadians have been accused of being carriers of water and hackers of wood, and we won't have any wood, and our water buckets will be full of selenium.
Fair point.
I think when it comes to the Elk Valley, that's another area we've heard a lot of promises, and the reality on the ground just doesn't live up to those promises. We know the tech really struggles with things that they do try to replant. Things are just dying. They don't want to grow on these areas that have been mined. And it's incredibly costly. And when you look at the kind of areas we're talking about, like 100 square kilometers, it's just, it would cost so much that they basically reclaim, a tiny bit every year, and then sort of, take some pictures for the brochure and say, look, we're reclaiming. But the reality is most of the area is not reclaimed. What has been reclaimed hasn't really worked. And there's no real long-term plan to reclaim the whole mine. I think, they're going to shut down and they'll be gone. And then it's up to the rest of us.
How can you destroy millions, billions of years of coevolution and then expect it to grow back? You've destroyed the whole sort of ecosystem, not just, it's a crazy, well, not a crazy idea, because I'm not suggesting you leave them as they are, but the idea that you could possibly restore it to what it was is just a complete fiction.
I think as well, we have to look very carefully at the words that are used: mitigate, restore, reclaim, remediate. Each one of those has different meanings, and what they mean to us may be completely different than the promise made by a coal company. And if the goal of one of these terms, restore or reclaim, is to just make things green again, I don't think it meets the needs of biodiversity, of restoring hydrologic effect, or of aesthetics. And just making it green, I can remember being involved in meetings years ago in the Crow's Nest Pass on trying to get something to grow on the coal spoil piles in Coleman. And the coal company was so proud of their efforts at actually getting some grass to grow. And when they were asked how much fertilizer was used, one of the other people in the audience reared back and said, well, if I use that much fertilizer, I could get grass to grow on a tin roof. So, this is the thing that we're up against, is you just don't turn a mountain upside down and expect that on those sterile spoil banks that are baked by sun, raked by the wind, that have no soil on them, that suddenly we're going to turn them green again. It just won't happen.
Awesome. Thanks for your thoughts on that, Lorne. The next question I have here is from Cynthia, and it's about the Old Man water allocation. And she asked, does anyone have an idea of what the percent of flow is for the Old Man River? I've also heard that a wealthy withdrawal is no more than 50% of the total flow of the river and 0% in dry seasons. Any comment on those numbers?
I don't have the exact figures in front of me, Nisa, but I think the issue that we have to face about these water allocations is, first of all, it would be giving water away free to coal companies. The second thing we have to recognize is that allocation, which was made in the days of the Old Man Dam and was primarily destined for irrigation uses upstream, may not exist anymore. It's paper water. It was yesterday's water. And with the impacts of climate change, that allocation of water may not exist anymore. And if it does, it currently is flowing in rivers and streams, keeping the aquatic environment alive. And since we have done no in-stream flow needs to define how much water could be safely taken out without harming the aquatic environment, the best answer at this point in terms of how much water should we allocate to coal mining, which by the way is going to be used for coal washing, should be 0.
All right. The next question I have is from Dave, and he's asking if there's a correlation between U-235 abundance in downwind, dust, and cancer. Dr. Takaro, you may have already answered this question, but I just thought I'd bring it up again.
Yeah, so U-235, uranium-235 isotope, is a main source of radon. So the alpha particles cause lung cancer and other cancers. The deadly aspect of the alpha particle is that it can go deep into your lung and stay there. So it just continues to release this radiation. And it is transported in dust particulate. So yes, it can travel, and there have been linked to cancers in Navajo miners in the US, for example, and I believe in other studies as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Takaro. The next question I have here is from Marv, and he would like to hear more about how changing democracy works in terms of bringing long-term change. Peter, did you want to elaborate a little bit further on that?
Well, I can elaborate a little bit from an Australian perspective.
Sure.
I mean, what we've seen in Australia is a gradual erosion in many ways of proper democratic process. So as I alluded to earlier, I didn't allude, I directly stated earlier, there's this very close relationship between not just government and fossil fuel industry, but, you know, sort of it's still tobacco, still big food, all these big agriculture and all, you know, big farming and all the rest of them, that people have much more access to government companies than individuals do, that they make enormous donations to political parties, and that's no doubt, it buys favors. They may not ask for something to be done because they don't need to ask. That the politicians know what's required if they want to get more donations. We've seen that laws have been changed to in some cases change, in some cases attempt to change them, to remove the ability of people like me to be peaceful demonstrators. We see a great undermining of the capacity for people to take cases to law. There are a whole range of issues. We lack at the national level in Australia an integrity or an anti-corruption commission. And so there's lots of examples of what we call pork barreling, money being given to particular electorates that aren't particularly based on any rational criteria. The one thing we do have still in Australia is a reasonably effective voting system, but I think you can question whether a first past the post, in effect, there is preferential voting, but a party like the Greens party that regularly gets 10% of the national vote doesn't get 10 to 12% of the national seats. They have probably about 6 senators and I think 1 or 2 members in the lower house out of 120 or 30. So I think there are many changes that need to be made to democracy to make it more representative of people. Now, it's not to say that I think that democracy should be all smoothness and light and everyone agree. On the contrary, we must encourage dissent, but it needs to be on a fair playing field. That would be my very brief summary.
I would add, in terms of the Alberta situation, to find out that the Kenny government was talking to Australian companies a year before they decided to get rid of the coal policy, is bordering on illegal. Like, that's like, on the stock exchange, that would be considered insider trading, and people would be charged.
I think this is the thing we see over and over. These big companies, you know, they get in control, they come in, and it's hard to rein them in. And that's what we've seen in the Elk Valley. Tech calls the shots, tech says what they're going to do, and the government says, okay. And that's the reality when, they're so big, they're kind of too big to fail now.
I think another thing, it's sort of along this topic, but it's why the role of the federal government is so important in this, particularly with joint federal panel hearings, is that allows people that wouldn't have standing under provincial legislation to actually participate in these hearings. The Alberta Energy Regulator, if they're the only ones that are going to make the decisions or hold the hearings to make the decisions about coal mines, will probably disqualify most of us from participating in these hearings because we don't have standing as defined by some economic benefit that we're deriving from the area or the adjacent areas. And so things like that are really part and parcel of maybe some would call it a rigged game, that the Albertans don't get to participate in decisions about their own resources.
Dr. Takaro, did you have a comment that you wanted to add?
Well, I agree with everything that's been said, and I just wanted to point out that the notion that too big to fail, that's something that we the people have enabled to a certain extent, and we enable it because it's very difficult to challenge it, particularly when government ministries are captured by industry. And by this, I'll put in the chat box the author and title of Kevin Taft, some of you may know from Alberta, wrote an excellent book called Oil's Deep State that describes the undermining of democracy by industry in this method that he calls capture, which is essentially just lobbying, but on a very strategic basis. And in that kind of environment, with rigged hearings, which we of course have had our share of here in British Columbia as well, it's very difficult to enact the kind of change that we're facing need for. And this is where nonviolent civil disobedience comes in. And it's an unfortunate place to be forced to be as a community. But the system is not as democratic as its name. And when that happens, nonviolent civil disobedience may be the only tool left to make democracy function properly.
Thank you for those remarks. I think I have time for one more question. And the last question is for Dr. Takaro. COPD, you mentioned it. Is that something that is from chronic exposure, or has it been cases where it's been linked to, not mine workers?
Yeah, so it is generally chronic exposure, but it is seen in community as well. Well, it's seen in many highly polluted cities in actually young ages even, but it is from long-term exposure. The question really boils down to what kind of exposures can you get on an annual basis in some of these mining valleys. And certainly in places in China with the combined pollution of coal burning factories and power plants with mining dust appears to synergistically increase the risk for COPD. And again, this is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, even in young people, women who have never been near a mine, and even children. We are beginning to describe a COPD phenotype in young children that may be from exposures in the womb. This part is still very early days, but there does seem to be in early childhood a respiratory disease trajectory that looks all the world like chronic obstructive pulmonary disease.
All right, thank you for that answer. So we'll have to conclude our question and answer period. Thank you so much, panelists. I do want to remind everyone that this recording is going to be posted to AWA's YouTube channel. So in case you want to share it with friends or family that wasn't able to attend, you can find it there. So for closing remarks and thank yous, I'm going to hand over the mantle to AWA's Conservation Director, Ian Urquhart.
Thank you. Thank you, Nissa. Thank you to all the groups who made this evening possible. Livingston Landowners, Council of Canadians, the Alberta chapter of the Wildlife Society, CAPE, who's done some excellent work with respect to the health impacts of coal in Alberta, going back to the debate about thermal coal in Alberta, and Yellowstone to Yukon and Yellowstone to Yukon Initiative, Extinction Rebellion, and of course AWA. I'm not going to try to summarize what I heard tonight at all, except to say that I want to thank all the speakers for the very powerful, the very informative presentations that they offered us all this evening. It's a bit humbling for me as I'm listening to our speakers tonight talk in effect about the many aspects of life and health on this planet that are really being affected by these developments. And what I mean by humbling, I mean it's not just simply about me. It's about other landscapes. It's about other species that we share this place with. So, yeah, I would just like to underline, I think, how informative and powerful I think the messages were that we received this evening. What I want to, I'm a recovering political scientist. I taught at the U of A for over 30 years, and so the discussions about government and democracy and that really go to the heart of where I've lived most of my life. And what I want to end tonight with is in a sense an indictment and really a call to action for everyone who's been with us this evening, and to the people you know. I mean, to the connections you have, to the, I hate the word network, but to the networks that you have out there to bring people in and get them involved in these issues. And so I wanted to end the evening actually with, and I put the link out earlier in the chat to a piece that Peter wrote. I'm glad he mentioned he was jailed. It saves me from doing it when I'm reading this particular piece, Peter. And I think these words are so important in thinking about this issue and the need. And I saw, who was it a few moments ago, Dave Klepacki talking about, in a sense, pushing governments to move in the directions of introducing coherent, sustainable economic plans for the societies over which they govern. So anyways, this is what Peter had to say about someone after he got to jail, and he's in this part of Queensland, and a booster of Queensland coal is there, and that fellow would say that, you know, Queensland coal is the cleanest coal in the world. He thought it was an essential part of Australia's and the world's future. This is hardly surprising and is not to be condemned. Workers, families, and communities in central Queensland deserve decent jobs, decent incomes, and a decent future. And in the context of Alberta, I would argue that people in the Crow's Nest and throughout this province deserve exactly those things. But then Peter goes on to say, and this applies in spades to the place we live in here, what should be condemned is the failure of Australian governments, particularly the current federal government, to plan for the future. Their failure to respond to the risks presented by climate change, their failure to work with communities and local industries to prepare economic and social development plans, not only for areas such as central Queensland, but also for existing coal-dependent regions such as the Hunter and Latrobe valleys. Plans that generate employment and are economically, socially, and environmentally sustainable. So Peter, thank you for that. Thank you for that piece and for those words, because I think, you know, that they are so applicable to the times and the challenges that we face here in Alberta. So with that, everyone, you know, stay well out there. Don't despair. Join the fight, and let's see if we can realize something of what Peter is talking about here in Alberta in the months ahead. So thank you everyone for participating this evening, and you know, and take good care.
Thank you again, everyone. Have a good evening.
Good afternoon for me.
Yes. Enjoy the rest of your day, Peter.
Okay, thanks. Bye.